What dark history do you know about your family? My father was always treated as the black sheep of the family, and I asked my dad why. He told me that his father used to be a traveling salesman and slept with another woman while on the road. His mother found out, confronted his father, and a huge fight ensued that ended with his father raping her. My dad was the product of this rape, and my grandmother never hesitated to treat him worse than his siblings, or to tell him why. My paternal grandfather was shot and killed. I knew this for a number of years, but never received any more information, and I was consistently told by my father that it was a stray bullet. Finally, after researching my family line, my sister and I came across a news article about his death. My grandfather had left my grandmother and was staying in a hotel while going through the divorce. He was shot and killed in that room. My grandmother was the prime suspect, and it was concluded that she hired someone to kill her soon-to-be ex-husband. It was never proven, and she was never charged. My father and aunt are certain she did it, and wouldn't speak to her between his death and until hers. When she died, she left all of her and their late father's money, a large fortune, to her college, none to her children. They took legal action to get some of the money, ended up being a little less than 5% each, on the grounds that she had murdered their father to keep his money. She was also apparently an insane alcoholic and emotionally abusive shut-in, but I learned that one from other stories I heard about their childhood in Long Island. TL. Doctor, paternal grandfather was murdered by hitman, hired by paternal grandmother. My family was the largest bootleggers in the Ossex area during Prohibition. The areas they sold in included southern Missouri, western TN, northeast Oklahoma and Tulsa, northern Arkansas, and parts of Kansas. They worked with the Italian Mayfair in Street Louis. I'm one of the few my grandma has told about it, and she showed me the journal of my great-grandpa Fritz. My family's main base was in Ava, Missouri, which is very rural even today. For the first few years that they did it, they didn't have any Mayfair connections, so everything really dirty they needed to get done, they did it themselves. They killed off competition. There was a lot of customers that owed money getting beat, wives or kids taken hostage, or burning down homes. The worst thing I found in the journal, apparently the government came to investigate 4 guys in suits, came onto the farm, and wanted to look around. My great-grandpa's cousin got scared and killed all of them, buried them out in the woods, and took their car to the south. The still is on the property somewhere still, underground. The barn that was on top of it burned down. My grandma is the only person who knows where it is, because some historical society wants to know more about it and take a look at the property. I think my grandma might be afraid of what they will find. My grandfather was in the Pacific Theater of World War II. He told me that when they were on Okinawa they found these Japanese soldiers raping and killing women in a small village. His unit went in and shot some of the soldiers and disarmed the rest. They held the soldiers up in front of the rest of the village and cut off their heads while they were still screaming. After that, he said they played a round of football with the Japanese officer's head. He showed me pictures they took after the incident. Scarred for life. My uncle was sexually molested by the deacon of their church as a kid. When he tried telling his parents, they didn't believe him, because in the 1950s the reputation of the accused was more important. It continued for 6 years, until he became too old. He began drinking at 14, and by 18 he had a serious addiction to alcohol, benzos and colludes. He was caught trying to steal a car, and given the option of jail, or joining the army. He joined the army, and was promptly sent to Vietnam for 3 years. He came home from the army, and at age 25 began acting strangely. He would cut his hands and feet to resemble stigmata, and insist that spies from the Vatican were telling lies about him to the neighborhood. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic with religious-based hallucinations and delusions. My family had him committed to the Illinois State Psychiatric Hospital, and he seemed to get a little better there, but was still very much mentally ill. This past July, the hospital he was in was closed by the governor. My uncle was given the option to go into a group home facility or to try independent living. He chose the latter, and we haven't seen or heard from him since July 2nd, when the facility closed. My grandfather was in Vietnam, and he witnessed a napalm strike. There was a little girl who crawled to him, screaming and begging for help, and my grandpa was too shocked to do anything. He shot her on the head to put her out of her misery. He said she couldn't have been more than 5. Not mine, but my boyfriend's grandfather worked for the Cray twins, notorious British gangsters. I've heard a few stories of blackmail. They threatened to murder him and his family if he didn't do stuff for them. My aunt was the biggest whore in her village back in Mexico. Like everyone knew her. She kidnapped my uncle, who was 15 at the time. She was 26. They came to the US and started a family over here. They are still happily married surprisingly. Edit, biggest, not most biggest. Aside from having a really Mayfair involved family, my great grandmother was a prospective bride for Mussolini. Apparently my family was very rich and pretty active in Italian politics, but wasn't his biggest fan. So when he started coming on to her, my family fled to America to protect her. One of my more distant relatives still has the many love letters he wrote her. I have no idea why she kept them, but I'm probably not a great person to be telling the story. I was 8 years old when I moved from California to California. My recently divorced mother and I started our journey by staying with my mom's sister and her husband as well as their toddler child. My mom and I stayed in a room together in their home. Things were going pretty well at first, but then I noticed how mean and degrading my aunt's husband was being towards me. I hated him for this, but could do nothing because, well, I was 8. I remember waking up in the middle of the night next to my mom and my aunt's husband was in the room. I didn't know what to think of it as a kid and simply dismissed it. He sat me down one time, being really nice to me and buying me ice cream, and told me not to tell my aunt that he was in the room. Of course I said okay, but on another day my aunt had asked me if I noticed anything weird between my mom and him, and I told her he's been in the room in the middle of the night. This is where the story started. It became apparent that my aunt's husband was in love with my mother. My mother refused him completely, at least as much as she could. He became obsessed with her. At this time, my mother and I had moved out to our own place. He would call her and visit her while she was at work or wherever, and kept finding excuses to come over to our new home. Eventually, it kept getting worse as my mom refused him. He managed to make a copy of our house key and had broken in a couple of times. At this point, my mom put 5 extra locks on the door to keep him out. He then started to stalk her everywhere she went. One time he showed up to her work asking for her with a bouquet of flowers. The office staff had been notified not to let him on the premises and thus escorted him out via security. He waited for her to get off of work and was waiting by her car begging her to take him. When she refused, he physically assaulted her by grabbing her wrist and slapping her in the face. A coworker of hers heard some hubbub and diffused the situation and he left. My mom told me to stay away from him. One day at school, 4th grade, 9 years, I was waiting for my mom to pick me up after school. I was in the front of the school lot with my friend. He suddenly pulled up and told me that my mom and him are fine now and that she asked him to pick me up. I hesitated and I was kind of scared, but I went along with him anyways. Then I noticed we weren't even going remotely towards my house. We were parking in a Target parking lot and he called my mom on his cell. He told her that he had me and that he wouldn't let me go until she came down to talk to him. I sat there, ashamed of being played. She came and my uncle shoved me out of the car and she made me march to hers while they talked and argued. At this point, my mom came back to the car and broke down asking why this was happening. My aunt finally got into the picture and it was time for him, her, and my mom to sit down and talk about this. They locked me and my toddler cousin, their son, in the next room where we could hear everything they were saying. I honestly can't remember what they were saying because my cousin had been crying the whole time. I found out recently, I'm 21 now, that after that had happened and my mom went to go smoke outside, he followed behind her and put a gun to her head. She begged and pleaded, saying I have a daughter, please don't do this. He backed off and that was the end of that horrible night. There were a couple nights where we had to stay at motels to keep away from him banging on our doors. The moment I mostly remember. My mom pulled me out of school early, claiming to me that it wasn't safe for me right now We rushed home in her car, him on the phone with her saying that he was coming over to end it. My mom was hysterical and begged again for him to stop all this. We went into our house, locked every single door and ran upstairs. From the window in her room, we can see the pathway leading towards our house. We watched him get out of his car and start walking towards our door, a large kitchen knife in hand. I was crying so hard while my mom was embracing me, crying as well. She was on the phone with the cops, yelling out the window that she had done so, and after 10 minutes he ran off. Later on we heard that they had gone to his house and arrested him. So after all this bullshit ended, more bullshit emerged. My aunt had begged my mom not to press charges and tried to convince us that he's a good guy. Up to this day, she's still with the bastard. Most likely for financial purposes, but still. Really, they're still together. My mom and I are fine, of course with a restraining order, and haven't seen him since then, and they live 30 minutes away. 12 years after that, the incident hasn't affected me much other than my great disdain towards anyone holding a large kitchen knife in my presence. No one else in our immediate family knew about our story. My cousin from a different aunt found out about 3 years ago when we sat her down and told her. My grandmother found out last year and from then on does not even mention his name. The one thing that kills me about all this is that my grandfather, who I respect and love more than anyone, has no clue, and he loves the guy. He suffered a stroke about a year and a half ago, so we really haven't bothered to tell him. P.S. I know it's a long post, but I've never written nor told anyone this story, so I wrote as much as I could. Some details are still missing, but there isn't a lot of time and energy to put into it today. Edit. I sincerely appreciate all the feedback, guys. Thank you so much. A lot of you have recommended I post to /r/letsnotmeet. And because of that I did. http://letsnotmeet/comments/112touch/how_can_an_obsession_goat/. One day my grandfather started dressing up to leave the house. It was the middle of winter in Canada. I was about 4 or 5 years old and the only Athegra person home. I asked him where he was going and he replied, "This is the last time you'll ever see me again." I remember not really understanding what he meant by that since I was so young. Before he left, he wrote something down on a big piece of cardboard using a stinky black permanent marker and set the note down by the toaster. I couldn't read at the time, so I have no idea what it said. Later that evening, he still hadn't come home yet. Eventually the cops get called and we find out he's dead. Apparently he went to a nearby cemetery with a bottle of vodka, sat down near a grave, and drank himself into a stupor. He froze to death. He's Russian. To her dying breath, my grandma denied there ever being a note. I know there was with absolute certainty. The marker he wrote it with remained in my grandma's basement for many years, and I would take off the cap from time to time, and the smell was so distinctive. It would take me back to that moment every time. And now that my grandma is gone, we'll never know what it said. How do you know this? What an awful thing to do to your grandmother. I have a great aunt and uncle who were involved in a murder-suicide. I believe he killed her and then shot himself. Found out about through a news clipping posted to Ancestry.com. He was my grandfather's brother. My cousin robbed a bank to buy fake boobs. My great uncle was the chief ballistics expert on the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's death and confirmed the one-shooter theory. He had a mysterious heart attack on a plane some years later. Arthur Zemian. I created a throwaway for this one. My grandfather, my mom's father, was a disgusting man. I hope he's burning in hell. Anyway, here's my mom's story. My mom was raped by her father from the age of 7 until the last time he did it, when she was 19. My grandmother knew. My grandfather had bullets, each for each member of the family. He had their initials carved in their bullet. He told my mom and grandmother, if they ever told, he'd shoot them both and then himself. He also raped at least 3 other children, including a 9-year-old girl in a grocery store bathroom. He lived a completely free life. He was never even arrested. My dad told me this several years ago. My mom doesn't speak about it. My dad said he found out when he was still in law school and my mom was a school teacher. He was home before her and watching one of those talk shows. The topic was people struggling with having a past of sexual abuse. Everything on the show reminded him of my mom and he freaked out. He confronted her about it when she got home and she told him the story I repeated above. I was a very small child, like 2 at the time. My dad was pissed because she knew this and allowed my sister and I to stay with our grandparents periodically. They're divorced now. I have no memory of ever being abused, but sometimes I wonder. I wonder more about my sister. She is 5 years older, which I think he preferred given my mom's age and the 9-year-old girl. As for my mom, she told me she forgave her father on his deathbed. She has always been a nutty person. We have never had a great relationship. We don't speak much. Edited for readability. I'm a great baby, and my great-great-great-grandmother survived the massacre at Wounded Knee. I learned recently that my great-uncle tried to grape my mom when she first came to America from the Philippines. She was taking a shower and locked the door and apparently he barged in and attempted to grape her. This was a member of my family who I loved and respected. I learned this from my dad who told me when I was alone in the car with him before going out to dinner with my sister. My parents are divorced. The reason my mom hasn't told anyone else in the family aside from her now ex-husband is because it would tear our large family apart. My great uncle and great aunt have been married for over 60 years and it would devastate everyone if word got out. I'll never look at him the same again. Just make sure he knows that you know your mom is owed at least that much. I'm fairly sure my uncle by marriage molested and probably impregnated his daughter Rose, my much older cousin. I put the pieces together when my mom mentioned that my cousin's first child had to have a blood transfusion at birth due to right-hand incompatibility. I'd just learned about this in school and that it can only occur with a second or later pregnancy. Now, Rose's father is and was the proverbial never leave your daughter alone with him kind of creep, and he and my aunt profess to be deeply religious. Their daughter Rose was pregnant when she married the first guy she ever snuck out to date when she was 17. This was the child who needed a blood transfusion, a second pregnancy following a shotgun wedding. When I speculated about all this to my mom, she said, "Oh my god. I seem to remember Rose having to go to the city for some kind of operation when she was about 14. This was in the mid-60s. To think of all the people who knew, or must have known, and chose not to protect this girl, turns my stomach. Of course, I have no proof, and if it's true, it's not my secret anyway, but if it is true, there's nothing I'd relish more than seeing my aunt and uncle, these judgmental God-fearing pillars of their community, outed as the evil ducks I believe they are." I had a cousin that apparently committed suicide, but my family says that it was actually a drug deal gone bad. Their proof is you don't run through the house shooting walls before getting to your room and shooting yourself in the head. Technically not my family, but my half-brother's grandfather. He was crazy and paranoid schizophrenic, and everyone is sure that the reason the black man at the back of his property disappeared was because he killed him, buried him under the house, and stole his land. My grandma had a daughter between my mom and my uncle. She was given away to a stranger because my grandma didn't have enough money to raise her and was tired of having daughters. I've got an aunt out there that I don't know. Background: my grandma has manuscript pretty bad and has been in a wheelchair for as long as I can remember. She has dementia as well. Not sure when it started, and I'm sure she has some other issues as well. My grandpa died of cancer when I was in middle school, which I didn't even really know he had until the end, but I guess he'd been battling it off and on for years. When I was in early/mid elementary, my grandma moved in with us. I didn't think much of it at the time and I don't remember my parents' explanation for it. I just assumed it was because my grandpa was old and having trouble caring for her. She stayed with us a few years and then moved back in with my grandpa. My mom told me last night that she actually came to live with us because my grandpa tried to strangle her. TL. Doctor, my grandpa tried to strangle his old wife. when my uncle, calling him Jake, was 17. About 25 years ago, one of his older brothers already had 2 children, a 7-year-old girl and a 3-year-old girl. Jake took my cousins, the little girls, into his bedroom and sexually molested them. He touched them inappropriately and forced them to touch his penis. Obviously, my cousins told their father, Jake's older brother. I'm not sure why, but he didn't press charges. I think my grandma had something to do with convincing him not to, in order to keep the family together. Jake and his brother, naturally, did not see each other for years. My cousins even come to family functions, where Jake is present, even though they have complete reason to never talk to him, see him, or my grandparents again. Sadly, this is not the end of the story. 4 years ago, when I was 16, my uncle Jake was arrested. He had been caught looking at child pornography. He somehow managed to stay out of jail, but was on probation, was not allowed to live alone. He moved in with my grandparents, and was not allowed to come into contact with anyone under the age of 18. Meaning, for nearly 2 years, I could not go to my grandparents' house. Strangely, Jake was allowed to keep his job at a local store, even though mothers with children would obviously shop there. Jake was forced to find a sponsor, an advisor-like person, and he chose my dad. Now that I'm an adult, Jake is constantly over at our house, talking to my dad. I find him repulsive, and have not been able to look him in the eye since I found out. As a family, we are supposed to keep this secret, but all I want is for Jake to go to jail, or somewhere farther duck away where there are no people. All these great stories, and all I have, is the standard cheating father married the cheater with a side dish of cover-up. She doesn't know that I know her past. She acts as a very righteous Christian, so it's quite funny to drop little hints. I love this movie, where the cheating woman tears the family apart. It's pretty clear she's just terrible, right?